Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the medium tank M3, also known as the M3 Lee or M3 Grant. The M3 is a rather unique tank. It is a stopgap measure created by the United States during a time when the United States really wasn't putting as much effort into tank development and kind of had to play catch up in order to get involved in the conflict happening in Europe during World War II. And while it has an incredibly short service life, its importance and impact on tank development, especially for the United States, will be felt for decades. But let's go ahead and look at the origins and history of the M3. Now, as I say, the United States was behind the rest of the world in terms of tank development at the time. And in fact, during the interwar period, the United States only built about 35 tanks. And so they started towards the end of the 1930s, really start putting effort into tank development. And that's where they created this, the M2 medium tank. Now, the M2 medium had basically taken a lot of features from the M2 light tank and created a much more updated modern tank. The idea was that they now employed this 37 millimeter gun along with a pair of coaxial guns and much better sloped armor to provide better protection. But showing how far behind in development the United States was compared to the rest of the world, by the time it was released, it was already behind tanks such as the French S-35 and the German Panzer III. And with the war in Europe escalating, and especially by the time we get to the Battle of France, showing heavier and heavier tanks being developed, better guns and things like that, it's pretty much decided by the United States that the M2 medium tank is not going to cut it, and there's a need for a bigger tank. So the United States begins to rectify this issue with the development of what's known as the National Munitions Program. And the whole purpose of this is to build the United States a force of medium tanks with a minimum of 1,700 tanks by the end of 1941. And the authority is put under this man, Brigadier General Adna Chaffee Jr. Now, it is his responsibility to take over tank development and get the United States moving. Now, remember, at the time, the very popular school of thought on tank development, especially among the British and the French, was to split your tanks into two groups, your infantry and your cavalry tanks. And instead, this was going to be singular design, one unified tank development. And so he starts pushing for the development of a new medium tank. Now, the biggest requirement for this new medium tank is that it had to be able to deploy a 75 millimeter weapon in its turret. This would be the minimum size needed to take on German armor. So to test this 75 millimeter gun, a modified medium M2A1 was equipped with a 75 millimeter self-propelled gun. This tank, known as the T5E2, was basically to test the ability to use a 75 millimeter pack howitzer as a main gun and give the United States the beginnings of what it needed in terms of tank development. Now that they had a gun capable of penetrating German armor, they needed a tank. Now, instead of going ahead and building an entirely new tank, they go ahead with the existing M2 medium tank hull. However, they redesign the superstructure and keep its 37 millimeter turret. But they take the 75 millimeter gun and put it in an offset sponson mounted on the side of the tank, thus giving the M3 two main guns, which, while not that common, was seen on other tanks such as the French Char B1 and the Mark I version of the British Churchill tank. Now, because the United States didn't have to redesign and start all over with tank development, they could produce the M3 much faster than they could if they needed to produce an entirely new tank, which the British needed. So there was such a demand for this tank that they went ahead and started putting in the design. Now, obviously, with this design, there were some limitations. The tank didn't have the full traversing for that heavy gun, so it had to put itself into certain positions to fight. But the flaws of the tank basically were not great enough that the United States was going to abandon the design, and they went ahead and started production of the M3. Now, at this point, the British were basically desperate for new tanks. The battle at Dunkirk had really cut off a lot of the equipment the British had been using, and they needed to replace their stocks. And so they started really wanting this tank as quickly as possible. Now, it wasn't perfect. It did have some problems. And one of the first things the British did is they wanted to modify the turret. Now, these modifications by the British included redoing the bustle rack at the rear of it to allow it to accompany a wireless set so they could have communications with it. They wanted thicker armor on the turret than the US design. And the machine gun cupola that was on the American version was replaced with just a simple hatch. They also extended the space within the turret to allow for the use of a smoke bomb launcher. Now, all of these modifications on the tank changed its designation, and so this version of the M3 became known as the Grant, and the previous version became known as the Lee. Now, the first combat experiences for the M3 were actually for the Grant models, as they were sent to the British directly to Egypt for the conflict in North Africa. Now, most of these modifications were to allow the tank to fight in a desert environment, such as sand shields and things like that. However, overall, the tank provided the British the firepower they needed to support them in the North African desert. And the tanks actually caught the Germans off guard. Basically, the Pak 38s that the Germans were using against Allied armor couldn't reach them, and the 75 millimeter gun would actually penetrate German armor, which they were unprepared for. So the Germans actually had to basically redo their thinking on how to go against these vehicles. Now, due to their vulnerability against the Pak 88s, their high mounted silhouettes and things like that, they were kind of replaced rather quickly with the new M4 Sherman, which was the improvement upon the M3, utilizing most of the same components. Now, while the British, for the most part, were pretty happy with the M3 Grant variant of the M3, the Soviet Union did not like it. Now, while they did like the Grant more than the Lee, most of them were shipped the Lee, and they hated the tank. They had nothing but problems with it, and they favored their own tanks much over the M3 Lee. Now, on the other side of the war in the Pacific theater, the M3 continued to see limited combat action. The Army very rarely deployed the M3. The Marines actually never even used the M3s. They went from using M3 Stuarts directly to M4 Shermans. British Indian Army units did deploy M3 Grants in the Southeast Asian theaters, and the Australian Army actually was given a large amount of M3s, but they were mostly used for defensive and training purposes. The largest usage of M3s during the Pacific theater is actually going to come by the British in Burma, where the British took out Japanese Type 95 Hagos rather easily. Now, by the end of 1943, both the Soviet Union and the United States stopped using the M3. Now, the British would keep using it till the end of 1945, and the Australians actually would use it until the 1950s, and the Brazilians actually had them for around the same time. Now, while the overall tank was not used for that long, in fact, its entire combat experience for the United States was only about 2 years. Overall, it only had about a 5-year service life. Its design would be used in multiple variants. Now, besides just talking about the Lee and Grant and their own individual variants, which are basically up guns and upgrades of each versions, there was also command vehicle variants, armored recovery vehicles, beached armored recovery vehicles, self-propelled guns, gun motor carriages, all designed as different variants, including upgraded tanks known as the Ram tank built by the Canadians. But the most famous variant of the M3 Lee is the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman utilizes the basic track structure of the M3 and a lot of the basic components with an entirely new superstructure and turret design, as the M3 was never supposed to be a permanent tank until the M4 could be developed and built. Now, due to the sheer number of these tanks made in such a short amount of time, there are quite a few examples in museums around the world, and they can be found in the United States, England, Australia, Russia, and places like that. But there you have it, a real quick look at the M3 Lee Grant tank, a medium tank that was basically designed for one purpose, and that was to give the United States time to develop something better. That something better being the M4 Sherman. And while its career was really short, it did show a lot of value in a lot of its developments, whether it be the design of its 75 millimeter gun, the usefulness of its actual dual turret, the flexibility of being able to adapt and modify a tank in the field. It was a crucial part of the United States tank development and would allow the United States not only supply the British with the tanks they needed at the beginning of the war, but give them the time to develop the M4 Sherman. But that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.